I never thought I'd install 16 security cameras, build a SWAT-like command center, and turn someone's expensive Range Rover into a minefield. Until I met Linda Sterling. The harsh sound of tires screeching filled the morning air as the luxury SUV barreled onto my property for the 9th time this month. This time, Linda wasn't just trampling my vegetable garden. She brought her HOA inspection team, carrying measuring tapes and snapping photos as if they owned the land that had been in my family for 3 generations. I gripped my coffee mug tightly, watching my small drone hover silently, recording everything. Game on, Karen. Where are you watching this video from? Comment below so I can know which country has the scariest Karens. My name is Jake Thompson, and the 20-acre ranch you're looking at has been in my family since my grandfather purchased it back in the 1950s. For 40 years, it sat peacefully at the edge of Milton County, surrounded by other farms and open land. That all changed 5 years ago, when Oak Ridge Estates, an upscale housing development, broke ground right next door. I didn't mind the new neighbors at first. Change is inevitable. And the property values rising actually helped my tax situation. Then Linda Sterling moved in and became HOA president within 6 months. The problem started almost immediately. It began with complaint letters about the aesthetic violations of my farm equipment, visible from their community walking path. The thing is, my property isn't even part of their homeowners association. I thought it was just a misunderstanding at first. I even invited Linda over for coffee to discuss property boundaries, but she arrived with a notebook full of violations and barely touched her drink while lecturing me about how my rural eyesore was affecting their property values. The situation might have remained at that irritating but manageable level if I hadn't discovered the surveyor stakes one afternoon. Someone had hired professionals to measure portions of my land while I was in town, moving boundary markers a good 15 feet into my property. When I called the surveying company, they confirmed they'd been hired by Oak Ridge Estates HOA. That same week, I found a section of my fence had been deliberately damaged, creating a shortcut path from their development straight through my property. It seemed Linda had been using it to shave 10 minutes off her walk to the spa on the other side of my land. These weren't innocent mistakes. This was a calculated attempt to encroach on my property. I installed my first security camera that evening, hiding it in an old oak tree overlooking the damaged fence. What I saw over the next week made my blood boil. Not only was Linda regularly using the path, but she'd brought friends along, pointing at my barn and chicken coops with exaggerated disgust as if giving a tour of something offensive. I'm not confrontational by nature. 12 years in the military engineering corps taught me patience and strategy. My late wife used to say I was aggressively reasonable. I'll find solutions where others find enemies. But when Linda showed up at my door with 5 HOA board members demanding I relocate my chicken coops because the smell is affecting our high-end residential area, something in me hardened. I politely explained that agricultural operations have precedence in this county, and my farm was here decades before their development. Linda's face twisted into a smile that never reached her eyes. We'll see about that, Mr. Thompson. Laws change when enough people with resources want them to. That evening, reviewing my security footage, I caught something that sent a chill down my spine. Linda and her husband Robert, a prominent real estate attorney, standing at the edge of my property, pointing and discussing what sounded like an expansion plan and how to handle the Thompson problem. My 14-year-old daughter Sophie found me in my workshop later that night, surrounded by military manuals and sketching something on graph paper. "Dad, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. I hadn't realized how intense I must have looked, hunched over my designs with determination etched on my face. I'd been working on a prototype monitoring device, something I'd designed during my military days but simplified for civilian use. "Just working on some security upgrades, sweetie," I told her, trying to sound casual. Sophie had already lost her mother to cancer 3 years ago. The last thing she needed was to worry about losing our home, too. Just as I was showing her my designs, we heard a sharp crack from outside. One of my experimental warning devices had accidentally triggered, creating a small bang that echoed across the property. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of Linda Sterling jumping back from my fence line, her face a mask of shock and fear before she scurried back toward Oak Ridge Estates. The game was about to change, but I had no idea how dirty it would get. The rumors started circulating the following week. First, it was whispers at the local grocery store, people giving me strange looks or suddenly finding reasons to be in different aisles. Then Sophie came home from school in tears. "The kids said we're running an illegal operation, Dad," she sobbed. "Madison's mom won't let her come over anymore because she heard we're dangerous." I held her tight, anger building inside me. This wasn't just an attack on me anymore. They were going after my daughter. A quick search online revealed what was happening. The Oak Ridge Estates community forum, which someone helpfully screenshotted for me, was filled with Linda's posts suggesting my unusual military background and suspicious late-night activities might involve illegal operations. She'd even hinted that I might be constructing explosive devices in my workshop. The rumors had spread beyond their gated community into the wider town. I tried talking to Sheriff Mike Johnson, an old-school lawman who'd known my family for years. "I hear what you're saying, Jake," he said, looking uncomfortable in his office chair. "But without proof she's deliberately spreading these rumors, there's not much I can do." I could tell something was off about his demeanor. Later that day, Ray Martinez, my neighboring farmer, filled me in. "Robert Sterling is golfing buddies with half the town council," he explained as we leaned against his fence. "Word is, he's been talking about expanding Oak Ridge to Phase 2, and they need more land. Your place is in their sights." Ray should know. He'd sold 10 acres to them last year, after what he called strange incidents made farming difficult. Water lines mysteriously cut, complaints filed with the county every week. Suddenly selling seemed easier than fighting, he admitted with regret, heavy in his voice. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, painting a disturbing picture. The environmental inspection team arrived without warning 3 days later. Someone had filed a complaint about toxic runoff from my property contaminating the groundwater. I welcomed them in, confident they'd find nothing because I ran an entirely organic operation. The inspectors seemed embarrassed. Clearly they'd been pressured into making this a priority. They found nothing wrong, of course, but that didn't stop the town council from issuing me a citation for potential environmental violations and a $500 fine. Councilman Williams, a thin man with a permanent politician's smile, delivered it personally. "Just a precaution, Jake," he said smoothly. "I'm sure you understand. We have to take all complaints seriously." The way his eyes slid toward Oak Ridge Estates told me exactly where the pressure was coming from. Robert Sterling's influence was clearly far-reaching. That evening, as I was testing a temperature sensor in my workshop, it sparked unexpectedly. I glimpsed Linda at the edge of my property with her phone out, likely documenting what she'd claim was proof of dangerous activities. The final straw came when my livestock started getting sick. First the chickens, then 2 sheep. The vet was baffled until we tested the water in the western section of my property, the part closest to Oak Ridge Estates. The results showed traces of chemicals typically found in industrial-grade weed killers, something I'd never use on my organic farm. Someone had deliberately contaminated my water supply. Sophie's favorite lamb died that night, despite our best efforts to save it. I held my daughter as she cried herself to sleep, something breaking inside me as her tears soaked my shirt. I'd been playing defense, trying to be reasonable, but the realization hit me like a physical blow. These people wouldn't stop until they had my land, regardless of who they hurt in the process. "I'm sorry, Dad," Sophie whispered as she finally drifted off to sleep. "I know you're trying." Her words hit me harder than any of Linda's schemes. My daughter thought I was failing to protect our home. That night, I sat in my workshop until dawn, the military engineer in me awakening after years of dormancy. I'd spent 12 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, specializing in perimeter security and surveillance systems. I'd designed protection for bases in conflict zones, where threats were constant and ever-evolving. I'd been using perhaps 10% of my skills trying to protect my farm, no more. Linda Sterling had declared war on my family, and I was going to respond accordingly. I pulled out my old footlocker from the attic, dust covering the reinforced case I hadn't opened since leaving the service. Inside were my field manuals, design notebooks, and specialized tools, the accumulated knowledge of my military career. "Time to put it to good use," I murmured to myself. As the sun rose over my property, I wasn't just Jake Thompson, widowed farmer anymore. I was a man with a mission, drawing up battle plans for what I'd come to call Operation Stop Karen. The morning light caught on something reflective by my fence line, a new surveyor stake planted well within my property. They were getting bolder, so would I. The The next 2 weeks transformed my farm into what Sophie jokingly called Fort Thompson. I installed a comprehensive security system that would make military bases envious. 16 weatherproof cameras with night vision capability positioned strategically around the property, motion sensors along common entry points, and a central monitoring station set up in what used to be our guest room. Sophie proved to be an excellent accomplice, helping me conceal equipment and even suggesting improvements to the camera angles. "If we put one in the big oak tree, Dad, we can see all the way to their clubhouse," she pointed out while reviewing our property map. My daughter had inherited her mother's sharp eye for detail and my stubborn determination, a formidable combination that made my heart swell with pride, even as I worried about the battle we were facing. We worked as a team, turning our home into an information-gathering fortress while maintaining its outward appearance as a simple family farm. While the security system took shape, I reached out to other farmers who had dealings with Oak Ridge Estates. Ray Martinez introduced me to 3 other local landowners who had similar stories: mysterious property damage, harassment through regulatory complaints, and eventually pressure to sell. "They tried the same water contamination trick with me," said Ellen Reeves, an elderly orchard owner who'd ultimately sold 8 acres to the development. "I couldn't prove it was them, but my apple trees started dying right after I refused their first offer." We formed an informal alliance, sharing information and evidence. Ellen's grandson, a law student, helped me understand the legal boundaries of what I could do to protect my property. "Document everything," he advised, "and know exactly where your property lines are. Get your own survey done if necessary." I took his advice immediately, hiring an independent surveyor who confirmed what I already knew. Oak Ridge had been systematically moving boundary markers, attempting to create a new reality on the ground. Linda noticed the changes on my property and escalated her tactics accordingly. The HOA meetings, which my new directional microphone could pick up when held on their community deck, frequently featured discussions of the Thompson nuisance and strategies to address it. Councilman Williams proposed a zoning amendment that would reclassify my area as residential development priority, potentially allowing for eminent domain claims if the land was deemed underutilized. I began gathering evidence meticulously: recordings of trespassing incidents, documentation of the water contamination, photographs of the moved boundary markers, and witness statements from neighboring farmers. I also discovered something interesting while researching property records. 3 years ago, Robert Sterling's law firm had handled a suspiciously similar case in the neighboring county, where an old farm was eventually condemned after numerous health and safety violations mysteriously began occurring. Sophie continued to face social fallout at school, but instead of retreating, she channeled her frustration into our defensive efforts. She started documenting the behavior of Linda's daughter, Madison, who had gone from being her friend to one of her main tormentors. Madison said her mom calls our place hillbilly heaven, and that soon it'll be part of their tennis court expansion, Sophie reported one evening, her voice steady despite the hurt in her eyes. Her resilience amazed me, but it also strengthened my resolve. No one messes with my daughter's happiness. Sophie also proved surprisingly adept with the drone I'd purchased for aerial surveillance. "Military engineering genes," I told her with a wink as she masterfully piloted over our property, mapping potential vulnerability points and documenting the steady encroachment from Oak Ridge Estates. The 9th invasion happened on a Saturday morning. I was inspecting the fence line when I spotted Linda's Range Rover leading a procession of 3 other luxury vehicles across my newly planted vegetable garden. They drove with deliberate slowness, crushing rows of organic tomatoes and peppers that Sophie and I had spent weeks nurturing. Linda emerged from her vehicle wearing designer boots that she didn't think twice about planting in my cultivated soil. 6 HOA members fanned out with measuring tapes and clipboards, acting for all the world like they were surveying their own property. I approached calmly, phone recording in my pocket. "You're trespassing on private property," I stated flatly. Linda's smile was venomous. "Actually, according to our updated survey, this section falls within the Oak Ridge Estates expansion zone." She held up an official-looking document. "Perhaps you haven't received the notice yet, but this area has been rezoned." It was a blatant lie, but the confidence with which she delivered it was almost impressive. As they continued their survey, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. They were placing small flags in a pattern that exactly matched the tennis court blueprint I'd seen on their community website. I didn't confront them further that day, choosing instead to document everything with my concealed cameras. As Linda's Range Rover pulled away, I noticed her usual route. She always used the same path, cutting across my southwestern field, a shortcut she'd been taking regularly, despite it being well within my property lines. An idea began forming in my mind. That evening, I placed a tiny GPS tracker under her vehicle's wheel well while it was parked at the community clubhouse during their monthly wine tasting event. The data confirmed what I'd suspected. Linda used my property as a regular throughway, driving across it at least twice daily. "Dad, what are you planning?" Sophie asked, noticing the gleam in my eye as I studied the GPS tracking patterns. I showed her my sketch for what I called the Minefield Project. Her eyes widened, then a slow smile spread across her face, the first real smile I'd seen in weeks. "That's genius," she whispered. Our counterattack was taking shape, but as we finalized our plans, I discovered something alarming in the town council's public records, a rarely invoked statute called Regulation 47.3 regarding abandoned agricultural land. That's when I realized they weren't just harassing us. They were setting up a legal framework to take our land outright. The stakes had just gotten much higher. Regulation 47.3 turned out to be an obscure county provision, allowing for the reclassification of abandoned or severely underutilized agricultural lands in areas designated for development expansion. If a property was deemed abandoned, a surprisingly subjective determination, it could be subject to compulsory purchase at below-market rates. Through careful research and a few discreet conversations with a sympathetic clerk at the county records office, I discovered that Robert Sterling had been instrumental in reviving this long-forgotten regulation 3 months ago. The timing wasn't coincidental. I also learned they needed to demonstrate that my land was being underutilized or poorly maintained, explaining the sudden interest from various inspection agencies and the flurry of complaints. "They're building a paper trail," I explained to Sophie as we reviewed the documents spread across our kitchen table. "If they can show I'm not actively farming or that the property is in disrepair, they can trigger Regulation 47.3. My daughter's face hardened with determination. "Then we need to make sure everyone sees this place is very much active and well-maintained," she replied, already thinking ahead. "And we need to catch them in the act of trying to make it look otherwise." The GPS tracker on Linda's Range Rover revealed a predictable pattern. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, she drove across my property to reach her spa appointments, and every Saturday afternoon, she cut through again to attend her tennis lessons. The unauthorized path she'd created ran alongside my eastern field, where she damaged part of my fence to make a convenient shortcut. This predictability was exactly what I needed for my plan. Over the next 3 days, Sophie and I prepared what I called the Minefield, a series of harmless but highly effective deterrents hidden along Linda's usual route. I installed several small devices of my own design, mud geysers that could be remotely activated to spray a special mixture of mud and a military-grade harmless but nearly impossible to remove tracking dye. Mini flashbangs that produce bright flashes and minor noise without any danger, and a smoke-generating system that could create the illusion of a vehicle malfunction. All of these were carefully positioned and camouflaged along the path Linda's Range Rover regularly traveled. The technical aspects weren't particularly challenging for someone with my background, but ensuring everything remained non-harmful while still being effective required careful calibration. "We're not trying to hurt anyone," I reminded Sophie as we tested the mud geyser pressure. "We're just creating consequences for trespassing." My daughter nodded seriously, helping me adjust the spray pattern to ensure maximum coverage without excessive force. The mixture itself was 95% organic mud from our own pond, combined with 5% of a special compound I'd acquired through an old military contact, a non-toxic dye used in training exercises that appeared invisible until exposed to certain lighting conditions, but was nearly impossible to wash out completely. The mini flashbangs were even simpler, modified photography equipment that created bright flashes and sound effects that would startle but not harm. The smoke system utilized theatrical fog machines hidden in waterproof casings. Everything was designed to create an impression rather than cause damage, psychological deterrents rather than physical ones. While setting up our defenses, we continued gathering evidence of the Sterling's activities. Through our surveillance system, we captured Linda on phone calls discussing how they were wearing down that stubborn farmer, and Robert mentioning something about ensuring the Thompson property fails inspection next month. Their confidence was palpable and disturbing. They clearly believed their plan was working and that my land would soon be theirs. I also overheard Linda complaining to another HOA member about how I was deliberately provoking her by having my daughter ride her horse near the property line each afternoon, something Sophie had been doing for years before Oak Ridge Estates even existed. They really believe they're entitled to decide what happens on our land, Sophie remarked with disbelief after listening to the recording. Her innocence about how the world sometimes works was both heartbreaking and motivating. I was fighting not just for our property, but for her right to grow up believing that hard work and honesty matter more than money and influence. The day of reckoning arrived on a picture-perfect Thursday morning. Linda's Range Rover appeared right on schedule, cutting across my property with entitled confidence. Sophie and I were in our monitoring room, watching through multiple camera feeds as the luxury vehicle bounced along the dirt path. "She's approaching trigger point 1, Sophie reported, excitement evident in her voice despite her attempt to sound professional. I nodded, hand hovering over the control tablet. As the Range Rover hit the exact spot we'd marked, I activated the first system. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Bright flashes erupted from seemingly nowhere, accompanied by sharp popping sounds. Linda's vehicle swerved slightly, then continued forward, directly into position for Phase 2. "Smoke deployment," I said calmly, pressing the next sequence. Within seconds, harmless white smoke began billowing around the Range Rover, creating the perfect illusion of a vehicle malfunction. We watched as Linda's car came to an abrupt halt, her panicked face visible through our zoom lens, as she clearly thought her precious vehicle was about to explode. What happened next exceeded our expectations. Linda threw open her door and literally jumped out of the vehicle, landing unceremoniously in the soft dirt beside the path. Her designer outfit and perfectly styled hair were immediately compromised, but that was nothing compared to what came next. "Mud geyser activation in 3, 2, 1, I counted down, then pressed the final button. 6 carefully concealed nozzles erupted simultaneously, sending arcs of our special mud mixture in a choreographed pattern that covered the Range Rover from every angle. Linda's scream was so loud we could hear it without the microphones. The luxury vehicle transformed before our eyes from gleaming white to a splattered, dripping mess. But the true masterpiece was Linda herself, standing in shocked disbelief as mud rained down, coating her from head to toe. Sophie's laughter filled our monitoring room, a sound of pure joy I hadn't heard since before this nightmare began. "Dad, you're a genius!" she exclaimed, throwing her arms around me. We watched as Linda frantically tried to use her designer scarf to wipe mud from her face, unaware that the special tracking dye was already doing its work, bonding with the materials it touched. Linda eventually managed to get back in her mud-covered vehicle and reverse all the way back to Oak Ridge Estates, abandoning her spa appointment. Through our drone footage, we captured her hysterical arrival at her driveway, the comical contrast of the filthy Range Rover against the pristine backdrop of their manicured community. I couldn't have scripted a better outcome, but I knew this was just the opening move in a larger game. "They'll escalate now," I warned Sophie as we reviewed the footage. "We need to be prepared." Sure enough, that evening my phone rang with a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Thompson," came Robert Sterling's unmistakably smug voice, though with an edge I hadn't heard before. "I believe we need to discuss the incident with my wife's vehicle on your property today." I smiled to myself. He'd just admitted his wife had been on my property. "I'd be happy to discuss a trespassing incident that occurred on my land," I replied calmly. "Should I direct that conversation to the sheriff's office?" The silence on the other end was deeply satisfying. Robert finally managed to say they'd be exploring legal options before hanging up. Phase 1 of Operation Minefield had been a resounding success, but I knew the real battle was just beginning. The Sterlings weren't going to take this humiliation lying down, and I needed to be ready for whatever came next. The legal threat arrived via certified mail the very next morning, a cease and desist letter from Sterling and Associates law firm alleging deliberate sabotage of personal property and reckless endangerment. The The document demanded $50,000 in damages for the Range Rover and threatened criminal charges if I didn't comply within 5 business days. They'd conveniently omitted any mention of trespassing or the fact that the incident occurred on my private property. I passed the letter to Sophie, who read it with increasing indignation. "But they were on our land. How can they possibly sue US?" she demanded, her sense of justice offended. I explained how money and influence often shaped people's perception of right and wrong, especially in small communities like ours. "Don't worry," I assured her. "We anticipated this. It's all part of the chess game." That afternoon, I noticed increased activity at the Oak Ridge Estates clubhouse. An emergency HOA meeting was clearly in progress, with Linda gesticulating wildly at the center of it all. The smear campaign intensified over the following days. Linda appeared on local news discussing dangerous conditions at neighboring properties and the need for stronger oversight of legacy agricultural zones. Meanwhile, Robert worked his connections behind the scenes. 3 different regulatory agencies scheduled inspections of my property within the same week. I welcomed each team with calm professionalism, giving them full access while our hidden cameras documented everything. One building inspector lingered by his truck after completing his official business. "Just so you know, Thompson," he said quietly, "I got 3 calls pushing for this inspection. Someone really wants to find problems with your place." Sheriff Johnson arrived the following Monday with a court order requiring me to appear for questioning regarding property damage allegations. Mike had known me for years. He'd been friends with my father, but the pressure from the Sterlings was evident. I showed him our comprehensive security footage of Linda's repeated trespassing, including clear timestamp evidence proving she'd used my property as a shortcut at least 26 times in the past month alone. "I'm also happy to show you exactly what happened during the incident in question," I added, queuing up the footage from our minefield activation. As you'll see, there were no damaging devices, just some harmless theatrical effects and biodegradable mud. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week, but the Sterlings weren't waiting. Linda organized a community safety awareness meeting at Oak Ridge Estates. Sophie infiltrated the gathering by reconnecting with Madison under the pretense of wanting to repair their friendship. What she recorded was disturbing, Linda describing me as a mentally unstable veteran with access to military-grade weapons, who had threatened HOA members performing community duties. More concerning was Robert's presentation about Regulation 47.3 and how it could be used to protect community interests against negligent land use. They were laying the groundwork for their endgame, having my property declared abandoned or underutilized despite all evidence to the contrary. The preliminary hearing itself was brief but revealing. Robert Sterling presented photographs of the mud-covered Range Rover and submitted affidavits from 3 HOA members alleging they had witnessed me conducting suspicious activities near the property line. When it was my turn, I calmly presented our time-stamped video evidence showing Linda's repeated trespassing, along with documentation of the moved boundary markers and contaminated water supply. Judge Winters ordered a more thorough investigation and scheduled a full hearing in 30 days. As we left the courthouse, Linda and Robert Sterling stood waiting. Linda's usually perfectly composed face was twisted with rage. "You think you're clever with your little mud traps and cameras," she hissed, "but you have no idea what you're up against. By the time we're done, that pathetic farm will be a parking lot." Robert placed a restraining hand on his wife's arm, but his eyes were equally cold. 40 days, Thompson," he said quietly. "That's how long you have left on that property. We've dealt with stubborn holdouts before. The threat was unmistakable, but so was the desperation behind it. As their luxury sedan pulled away, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were planning something drastic. That night, Sophie voiced the concern that had been growing in my mind. "Dad, what if they don't wait for the court date? What if they try something more direct?" Her question proved prophetic. Just after midnight, our entire property plunged into darkness as the power was cut. Within minutes, the backup system kicked in, restoring power to our security system. Through the night vision cameras, we watched in disbelief as not 1, but 4 Range Rovers approached from the Oak Ridge Estates direction, headlights off, moving with clear purpose toward our main property line. "Call Sheriff Johnson," I told Sophie, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. As she made the call, I activated our property's external speaker system. "Attention!" my voice boomed across the darkened fields. "You are trespassing on private property. Security systems are active and recording. Retreat immediately." The vehicles paused momentarily, then continued their advance. I could make out Linda's unmistakable silhouette directing operations like a field general. More concerning was the large piece of equipment being towed behind one of the vehicles, a small excavator. This wasn't just trespassing anymore. They were planning some form of property destruction. The real war for Thompson Farm had begun. The excavator confirmed my worst fears. The Sterlings and their HOA allies were taking direct action to damage my property in a way that would be difficult to reverse. Through our night vision cameras, I watched as Linda directed the small convoy toward my recently replanted eastern field, the most visible part of my farm from the Oak Ridge Estate's perspective. "What are they doing, Dad?" Sophie whispered, her face illuminated by the glow of our security monitors. "They're trying to create evidence of abandonment," I explained, pointing to the survey flags and signage they were unloading. "If they can tear up enough of the field and place their markers, they'll claim this section has been incorporated into Oak Ridge under Regulation 47.3. The excavator's purpose became clear. They intended to literally reshape my land, destroying crops and creating a new physical reality overnight that would be difficult to disprove in court. "Time to activate Nightfall Protocol," I told Sophie, who moved to her position at the secondary control panel. We had designed our defensive systems with multiple escalation levels, and Nightfall was the most comprehensive, a coordinated sequence of non-harmful deterrents designed to repel serious incursions. The first phase began with another announcement that law enforcement had been notified. The trespassers continued when no immediate police presence materialized. Perimeter lights in 3, 2, 1, I counted down, then activated the system. Instantly, powerful floodlights concealed throughout the property blazed to life, bathing the entire area in harsh white light. The intruders froze, momentarily blinded and exposed. Linda recovered quickly, shouting orders to continue despite the illumination. The excavator started its engine, its operator maneuvering toward my eastern fence line. "Moving to Phase 2, I announced, activating our more dramatic countermeasures. A series of warning flares shot into the night sky, illuminating the scene with red emergency light. Simultaneously, our firewall system engaged, a series of harmless propane torches embedded along the property line that created an intimidating barrier of controlled flames. Several HOA members began retreating toward their vehicles, clearly having second thoughts about their midnight raid. Despite Linda's efforts to rally her forces, only the excavator continued its advance, now just yards from my fence. "Initiating acoustic deterrent and smokescreen," I told Sophie, who activated the twin systems with practiced efficiency. A series of harmless but extraordinarily loud bangs erupted from concealed speakers, while theatrical smoke machines began filling the area between us and the intruders. The excavator operator finally lost his nerve, powering down the machine and jumping from the cab. Through the smoke and flashing lights, the scene must have appeared apocalyptic to our would-be invaders. Linda's composure finally shattered. "Retreat! Everyone back to Oak Ridge!" she screamed, her designer boots slipping in the mud as she ran for the nearest Range Rover. The exodus was chaotic and undignified, with HOA members stumbling over each other in their haste to escape what they clearly believed was some kind of military-grade defense system. Within minutes, 3 of the Range Rovers had retreated, their taillights disappearing toward Oak Ridge Estates. One vehicle and the excavator remained behind, abandoned in the confusion. "They left evidence," Sophie observed, pointing to the excavator clearly visible in our security feed. I nodded. "This is better than I could have hoped for. They've provided physical proof of their intentions." The sound of approaching sirens signaled Sheriff Johnson's belated arrival. I deactivated our defensive systems except for the perimeter lights, which now illuminated a scene that told its own story. Abandoned equipment positioned to damage my property, survey flags placed well within my boundary lines, and the churned mud where multiple vehicles had trespassed. As a final touch, I activated our decoration system, the same non-toxic biodegradable paint and feather mixture we'd used on Linda's Range Rover, but this time deployed over the abandoned excavator. By the time Sheriff Johnson pulled up, The heavy machinery had been transformed into a pink and white polka-dotted art installation that no one could possibly claim belonged on my farm. Sheriff Johnson surveyed the scene with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant admiration. "What in God's name happened here, Jake?" he asked. Ray Martinez and several other neighboring farmers had arrived as well, having seen the commotion. Ray had his phone out, documenting everything. "We've got it all on video, Sheriff," I explained, leading him to our monitoring station, where Sophie was already compiling the key footage. Mike watched the footage in silence, his professional demeanor cracking slightly at the sight of Linda, directing operations like a military commander. "I'll need copies of all this," he said, his tone shifting to something more officially law enforcement. The remainder of the night was spent giving our official accounts and watching as the abandoned equipment was documented and eventually towed away. Word spread quickly through our small community, with Ray and the other farmers sharing video clips that found their way to local social media. By breakfast time, the story of the midnight raid on Thompson Farm and its spectacular failure was common knowledge throughout Milton County. As we prepared to leave for the emergency town council meeting that had been hastily called in response to the night's events, Sophie paused at the door. "Do you think they'll finally stop now?" she asked, hope in her voice tempered by our experiences. "The Sterlings don't strike me as people who accept defeat easily," I replied honestly. "But last night changed the game in ways they can't control. For the first time, the whole town is watching." What I didn't say was that during my research into Oak Ridge Estate's development plans, I'd discovered irregularities suggesting something more than aggressive expansion was at play. I had a strong suspicion that the obsession with acquiring my land wasn't just about tennis courts and property values. There was something on or under my property that made it particularly valuable to them. As Linda and Robert Sterling walked into the town council chambers that morning, they had no idea that everyone present had already seen video of their midnight raid. And they certainly had no idea that I'd discovered their biggest secret about Oak Ridge Estates. The town council chambers were packed beyond capacity when we arrived. Word of the midnight raid had spread throughout Milton County, bringing curious onlookers and even a reporter from the regional news station. Linda and Robert Sterling sat at the front, looking uncharacteristically disheveled. They had clearly expected to control the narrative, perhaps by filing complaints about my dangerous security systems. The shocked expressions on their faces when they saw the crowd's reaction to their entrance told me they were only now realizing how badly they had miscalculated. Councilman Williams, usually firmly in the Sterling's corner, was studying his papers with unusual intensity, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The meeting began with Sheriff Johnson's official report of the incident. The evidence spoke for itself. Security footage showed Linda directing the placement of survey markers on my property and the excavator preparing to destroy my crops. When Robert attempted to interject with a legal justification involving Regulation 47.3, Council Chair Patricia Davis cut him off sharply. When my turn came to speak, I approached the podium with the calm confidence my military years had instilled in me. "I'd like to address not just last night's incident, but the pattern of harassment and property violations my daughter and I have endured over the past 6 months," I began, then methodically presented our evidence: the water contamination, the boundary marker manipulation, the systematic regulatory complaints, and finally, the midnight raid. The council listened in growing discomfort as the full picture emerged. I concluded by addressing the underlying issue. This orchestrated campaign wasn't just about property values or aesthetics. It's about something much more valuable. 3 months ago, Midwest Minerals conducted a geological survey of this region. Their findings indicated significant natural gas deposits in a formation that runs directly beneath my property. I displayed the survey maps on the council's projection screen. 2 weeks after this survey was completed, Oak Ridge Estates filed for an expansion permit and began their campaign to acquire my land, not for tennis courts or housing, but for mineral rights access. I turned to face the Sterlings directly. Mr. Sterling's law firm doesn't just represent Oak Ridge Estates. They also represent Midwest Energy Partners, which has been quietly acquiring mineral rights throughout the county. Robert Sterling's face had gone from composed to ashen. Linda's expression shifted between confusion and anger. She clearly hadn't been fully informed about her husband's broader strategy. Council Chair Davis called for order as the room erupted in conversation, I provided copies of the mineral survey along with corporate filing documents showing the connection between Sterling's firm and Midwest Energy. Additionally, I've documented at least 3 other cases where similar tactics were used to pressure landowners to sell properties that coincidentally sat above valuable resources. The systematic nature of their operation was becoming clear to everyone in the room. This wasn't just about my farm. It was about a pattern of predatory acquisition disguised as community development. Councilman Williams suddenly found his voice, though it wavered slightly. I think in light of these revelations, we should reconsider the proposed zoning amendments affecting Mr. Thompson's property. His abrupt change of position wasn't surprising, political survival instincts kicking in as he distanced himself from what was clearly becoming a scandal. A motion was passed to formally rescind all pending actions regarding my land. Sheriff Johnson then approached the podium. In light of the evidence presented, I am investigating potential charges including criminal trespass, attempted property damage, water contamination as an environmental crime, and conspiracy to commit fraud through the manipulation of Regulation 47.3. The Sterlings were facing potential criminal charges. Linda finally lost her carefully maintained composure. "This is absurd! We were trying to improve the community. That eyesore of a farm is dragging down everyone's property values." Her outburst only reinforced the impression of entitlement that had turned public opinion against them. Robert attempted damage control, his lawyer's instincts finally kicking in. "My client wishes to withdraw her comments," he stated formally. "We look forward to addressing any misunderstandings through proper legal channels." But the damage was done. As the meeting concluded with a unanimous vote to protect existing agricultural properties from development pressure, the Sterlings found themselves isolated in a room that had once deferred to their influence. In the weeks that followed, the consequences unfolded with satisfying inevitability. The Oak Ridge Estates HOA held an emergency election, removing Linda from her position as president by an overwhelming margin. Robert's law firm placed him on administrative leave, pending investigation into his dual representation of Oak Ridge and Midwest Energy. The county prosecutor opened a formal investigation into the environmental tampering with my water supply. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome came from an unexpected direction. As news of the attempted land grab spread, other farmers and small property owners throughout the county came forward with similar stories of harassment and pressure from developers. A coalition formed to strengthen protections for agricultural land and require transparency in mineral rights acquisitions. 6 months later, I stood at the edge of my eastern field, now fully recovered and producing a record crop of organic vegetables. The abandoned excavator, still faintly showing traces of pink and white decoration despite numerous cleaning attempts, had been repurposed as a community art installation at the entrance to our newly established farmers market. Linda and Robert Sterling had sold their Oak Ridge Estates home and relocated to another state, their reputation in Milton County irreparably damaged. The criminal investigations were ongoing, but the civil penalties had already forced them to pay substantial restitution to affected landowners. Oak Ridge Estates itself had undergone a transformation, with new leadership that sought cooperation rather than confrontation with neighboring properties. Sophie joined me at the fence line, leading her favorite horse. "Mrs. Peterson said Madison misses me," she mentioned casually, referring to Linda's daughter, who had remained behind with relatives to finish the school year. She asked if Madison could come ride this weekend. I considered the request, appreciating how my daughter could separate the actions of parents from those of their children. "I think that would be fine," I replied, watching as the afternoon sun gilded the fields that had been at the center of so much conflict. "This place has always been about family and community. That hasn't changed." Sophie smiled, understanding the deeper meaning in my words. Thompson Farm hadn't just survived the Sterling's assault. It had emerged stronger, more connected to the broader community, and with its future secured for another generation. Occasionally, when a Range Rover drives past our property line, I still trigger a small, harmless pyrotechnic effect from our remaining security systems, just enough to make the driver accelerate quickly away. Sometimes I spot the decorated excavator from my workshop window, now serving as both a practical landmark for the farmers market and a reminder that standing your ground against bullies is sometimes necessary. The tiny flash of the special tracking die still shows up under certain lighting conditions on vehicles from that night, an invisible badge of participation in what local children now call the The Great HOA Invasion. The Sterlings thought they could steamroll a simple farmer and his daughter. They never realized that beneath the unassuming exterior of our family farm lay not just valuable natural gas deposits, but something far more powerful, the unbreakable foundation of a home worth fighting for. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let me know which country has the most entitled HOA Karens. And if you enjoyed this story of sweet engineering-powered justice, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of everyday heroes standing up to entitled bullies.